The lights dimmed across the hemispheric dome of the orbital holotheater, casting the audience, a mix of humans and various alien species, into darkness. Pinpoint stars appeared overhead, swirling into a galaxy that rotated above them. The holographic projection was so perfect that several visitors gasped, despite having seen similar displays dozens of times before. I stepped onto the circular stage, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly hushed space. The spotlight found me, a solitary human figure in simple black attire against the cosmic backdrop. "Welcome, travelers," I announced, my voice carrying to the furthest seats. "Welcome to Tales from Outer Space." Polite applause greeted me, punctuated by the clicking mandibles of Vespid attendees and the resonant hums from the Melos delegation. I smiled, scanning the audience, 600 beings from across 17 systems, all gathered for tonight's performance. Tonight's presentation brings you a special double feature. I continued, raising my hands as the galaxy projection behind me split into two distinct star clusters. Two tales, separated by decades and light years, yet bound by a common thread: the dangerous miscalculation of human capability. The hologram shifted, displaying a regal alien female with emerald scales and elaborate ceremonial armor. Her multiple eyes glittered with cruel intelligence. "Our first tale, Never Hire Human Mercenaries," I announced, as the title materialized in glowing script above the alien's head. The story of Duchess Endova of the Uzari Confederacy, who saw in humanity a potent weapon to wield against her enemies. What she failed to see was that weapons once drawn often cut the hand that wields them. The image shifted to a battlecruiser, sleek and predatory, moving against a backdrop of lesser vessels. "Our second tale, There Is a Reason," I continued, as this new title replaced the first. Admiral Vorak of the Trescan Alliance learned, too late, that the rules of warfare established by the Terran Dominion weren't arbitrary policies, but warnings. Warnings written in the blood of those who had tested them before. The hologram dissolved into pinpricks of light, and I spread my arms. "Politics and horror, ambition and destruction. Tonight we witness how two powerful beings from separate corners of the galaxy made the same fatal error. They underestimated humanity. Not out of ignorance, but out of arrogance." I lowered my voice, and the audience leaned forward in their seats. "In the far future, when humanity has spread among the stars, we remain what we have always been: dangerous. And there is a reason the wise tread carefully around us." The lights dimmed further, and my spotlight narrowed until only my face remained visible. Our first tale begins in the 124th year of the Uzari Confederacy, on the palatial moon of the Duchess Endova. The spotlight extinguished, and I stepped back as the holographic projection engulfed the theater. Duchess Endova paced the length of her war room, 8 legs clicking rhythmically against the polished stone floor. Around an oval table of rare blue crystal, her generals and advisors stood in uncomfortable silence. The holographic display at the center of the table showed the current territorial divisions of the Uzari Confederacy, her territory in emerald green, her rivals in various shades of red. There was too much red. "Unacceptable," she finally said, her voice like silk drawn over steel. Her forelimbs slashed through the hologram, disrupting the display. 3 consecutive defeats. Explanations: General Thraz, the largest of her generals, straightened his armored carapace. "The Uzari Southern Alliance has deployed new shielding technology. Our energy weapons cannot penetrate their defenses at standard engagement distances. We are forced to close to near-suicidal ranges." "And the Uzari Eastern Combine," Endova demanded. Similar difficulties, Your Eminence," replied another general. "Their forces have adapted quickly to our tactics. They anticipate our maneuvers." Endova flicked her secondary eyes in irritation, while her primary gaze remained fixed on the reconstituted map. The divisions had stabilized over 30 cycles, creating a stalemate none of the 3 factions could break. But she would not accept equilibrium. The Confederacy was hers to unite under her rule. "We need an advantage," she said finally. "Something unexpected. Something—" Her mandibles clicked thoughtfully, from outside our system. Her chief advisor, Tazulo, cleared his throat. Your Eminence, if I may, there is a species newly encountered at the Outer Rim, the humans of Terra. I'm familiar with them, Endova replied dismissively. Primitive, pre-jump technology, no established presence beyond their home system. Yes, Duchess, but they possess a quality that might be useful. Tazulo manipulated the display controls, and the galactic map was replaced by footage of human military exercises. They excel at projectile weapons. Endova watched with growing interest as the recording showed humans firing primitive ballistic weapons with remarkable precision. Projectiles. No civilized species has used such technology for combat in millennia. Precisely why our rivals would have no defense against them, Tazulo noted. Their shields are calibrated for energy weapons, not physical projectiles. And humans have developed a disturbing accuracy with these weapons. Their evolution on a high-gravity world has given them excellent depth perception and timing. Endova's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of excitement. Mercenaries, she whispered. We could hire human mercenaries. Your Eminence, interjected her Chancellor of Resources. The humans number 12 billion on their homeworld alone, all competing for limited resources. Their population would make them eager for off-world opportunities. Endova's 4 primary eyes glittered as the possibilities unfolded before her. What would they want in payment? Their world is resource-poor compared to our outer colonies. Land, suggested Tazulo. Promise them settlement rights on the moons of Cracks. The atmosphere is compatible with their biology, and we've considered the moons worthless since the mineral depletion. And technology, added the Chancellor. Controlled technology transfer. Nothing that would threaten our supremacy, but enough to entice them. Medical advancements, perhaps. They're a sickly species by our standards. Endova considered this, her legs carrying her, in another circuit around the table. Draft a proposal. I want human mercenaries deployed against the Southern Alliance within 2 cycles. Let's see how their fancy shields hold up against what they'll call... What's the human term? Bullets, Your Eminence. Yes, Endova purred, extending a limb to freeze the image of a human soldier mid-fire. Let's see how they fare against bullets. Admiral Vorak of the Trescan Alliance stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Inevitable Consequence. His 4 arms clasped behind his back as he surveyed the formation of his fleet. 67 warships arranged in perfect tactical spread, positioned at the Lagrange staging point between the gas giant Helix and its largest moon. The location was ideal for jump drive rehearsal, allowing for precise calculations away from planetary interference. Status report, he commanded. Commander Liss, his second, approached with a data pad. All vessels report ready, Admiral. Jump drive synchronization at 97%. The simulation suggests optimal conditions for the maneuver. Vorak nodded, his gray skin crinkling around penetrating yellow eyes. And our observers? The Terran carrier, Phoenix, maintains position at the arranged coordinates. They've sent the customary warning regarding jump protocols. Vorak snorted. The same tedious message they always send. No jumps into gravity saddle points. No jumps within minimum safe distance of stellar bodies. As if we need reminding of the basics of interstellar travel. He turned to face his bridge crew. The Terrans claim to have mapped the theoretical boundaries of jump drive capabilities, but they hoard their research. I suspect their warnings are more political than scientific, designed to maintain their advantages in interstellar travel. Commander Liss shifted uncomfortably. The Terrans have lost ships to jump drive accidents, Admiral. Their warnings stem from experience. Or from a desire to control key transit points, Vorak countered. Our theoretical models suggest a properly calculated jump into the saddle point between Helix and its moon would cut transit time by 63%. A strategic advantage we cannot ignore. But the risk is minimal with proper preparation, Vorak interrupted. That's why we're here, Commander. To test the theoretical edge of what's possible. He turned to his navigation officer. Proceed with the rehearsal. Full sensor recording. I want detailed analysis of jump field formation at each stage. Yes, Admiral, the officer replied, relaying commands to the fleet. On the main view screen, Vorak watched as the distant shape of the Terran carrier shifted position, slightly moving to what their safety protocols likely deemed a secure distance from the coming test. He smiled thinly. The Terrans were always so cautious. Admiral called his communications officer incoming transmission from the Phoenix. Let me guess, Vorak said dryly, another warning. No, sir. They're powering up their jump drive. Vorak spun toward the view screen. What confirm? Energy spike consistent with jump drive initiation, reported the sensor officer, her voice rising. They're attempting a jump into the saddle point. Impossible, Vorak breathed. They've been warning us against that very maneuver. The bridge crew watched in stunned silence as the Terran carrier's outline blurred, stretched, and then vanished in a flash of blue-white energy. Where did they remerge? Vorak demanded. The sensor officer worked frantically at her console. Unknown, sir. No emergence detected in system. Wait energy readings from the saddle point itself. They're holding position inside the saddle point. That contradicts everything we know about jump physics, Commander Liss whispered. Vorak stared at the readouts, his mind racing. The Terrans had just executed the very maneuver they had repeatedly warned against. Either their warnings were indeed political manipulation or incoming transmission from the Phoenix Admiral. On screen, Vorak ordered. The image of a human female in a Terran Dominion uniform appeared. Captain Eliza Ramos, her dark hair pulled back severely from a face that showed no emotion. Admiral Vorak, she said without preamble, we observe your fleet preparing for a jump drive exercise. Be advised that the maneuver you are contemplating violates the physical limitations of jump drive technology. Captain Ramos, Vorak replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. You appear to be executing that very maneuver as we speak. Negative, Admiral. The Phoenix is employing specialized stabilization technology classified by the Terran Dominion. Your vessels are not equipped with equivalent systems. The warning stands. Do not attempt jump translation into gravity saddle points. Vorak felt his crew's eyes on him. The Terrans were flaunting their technological superiority while denying it to others. His outer epidermis flushed with anger. Thank you for your concern, Captain, he said coldly. We will proceed with our scheduled exercises. The human's expression didn't change. That would be unwise, Admiral. Your warning is noted, Vorak replied, and signaled for the transmission to be cut. Once the screen returned to the external view, he turned to his crew. The Terrans think they can dictate the terms of space travel to us with vague warnings and classified technology. Today we prove that the Trescan Alliance charts its own course. He approached the navigation console. Modify the exercise. Prepare the scout vessel, Vanguard, for a jump into the saddle point. Minimal crew, full sensor package. Commander Liss stepped close, lowering her voice. Admiral, respectfully, we should reconsider. The Terrans are there now, Liss. Obviously, it can be done. Vorak's eyes narrowed. They don't own the stars despite what they'd have us believe. The commander hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Admiral. She moved away to relay the orders. Vorak turned his attention back to the view screen, where the saddle point between planet and moon glowed with unusual energy patterns. The Terrans were there watching testing, judging. His hands clenched. Before this day ended, they would learn that the Trescan Alliance would not be held back by arbitrary rules or false warnings. What Vorak couldn't know was that both he and Duchess Endova, separated by vast distance, but united in ambition, had set into motion events that would reshape their understanding of humanity. Both were about to learn why there are some lines that should not be crossed. The introduction of human mercenaries into the Uzuri Confederacy's military forces produced immediate and dramatic results. Within 16 days of their arrival, human special operators had neutralized the Southern Alliance's 3 primary shield generators. Operating in small teams, They infiltrated heavily defended installations, using simple projectile weapons that bypassed energy shields designed to stop Uzari weapons. The defenders, accustomed to the flash and scream of energy weapons, were unprepared for the silent efficiency of human snipers, who could target from distances previously considered beyond practical range. Duchess Endova watched the holographic battle reports with increasing satisfaction. The Southern Alliance was in disarray, its leadership retreating from formerly secure strongholds. Human mercenaries equipped with primitive but effective ballistic weapons moved through enemy territory with unsettling ease. Your strategy has proven effective beyond expectations. Your Eminence, Tazulo said, presenting the latest territorial map. Green had overtaken much of the red. The Southern Alliance is requesting peace talks. Unconditional surrender only, Endova replied, mandibles clicking in pleasure. And prepare our forces to pivot toward the Eastern Combine. I want pressure applied immediately. There is a complication. Her Chancellor of Resources interjected, approaching with evident discomfort. The human command has submitted a request. They wish to study the shield technology they've captured. Endova's secondary eyes blinked rapidly. That wasn't part of our agreement. They argue that understanding the enemy's technology allows them to better counter it, the Chancellor explained. Their commander, General Reeves, was quite insistent. The agreement specified limited technology transfer and payment, Endova said sharply. Not battlefield salvage rights. Tazulo cleared his throat. Your Eminence, the humans have proven extremely valuable. Perhaps some accommodation? Fine, Endova snapped. They may study the shield generators, but not remove or reverse engineer them. Make that explicitly clear. 6 weeks later, Endova received disturbing reports. Human forces now engaged with the Eastern Combine had been observed using modified shields. Not Uzari technology precisely, but clearly inspired by it. When confronted, General Reeves claimed the modifications were based on independent human development, not reverse engineering. They're lying, Endova hissed to her war council. They violated the terms. Unfortunately, Your Eminence, we've become dependent on their combat effectiveness, General Thraz pointed out. The Eastern Combine is falling back on all fronts. Replacing the humans now would stall our momentum. Endova paced agitated. How did they reverse engineer so quickly? Our researchers take years to adapt new technologies. Humans appear to have an unusually lateral approach to technological development, Tazulo offered. They don't follow established protocols. They improvise. More disturbing reports followed. Human mercenaries were observed with biological modifications, enhanced vision, reinforced skeletal structures, subcutaneous armor. When questioned, they claimed these were standard augmentations from their homeworld, though Endova's intelligence suggested otherwise. They were adapting Uzari medical technology to their own biology. Meanwhile, the number of human mercenaries grew. The initial force of 6,000 had swelled to nearly 30,000 as word spread back to Earth of the opportunity. They established their own quarters, their own supply chains, their own command structure, that while nominally reporting to Uzari authority, increasingly operated with autonomy. 8 months into the campaign, with 70% of Confederate territory reclaimed, Endova faced a new crisis. A delegation of human officers requested formalized rights to all captured technology. This violates our original agreement, she said coldly to General Reeves, who stood before her in the palace war room. Reeves, a tall human with weathered skin and calculating eyes, simply nodded. The original agreement has proven insufficient, Duchess. My forces have delivered victory after victory. We've suffered casualties. We've expended resources. The compensation structure needs to reflect our contribution. You've been paid exactly as agreed, Endova countered. Land on cracks, medical technology transfers. What more do you want? No. Equity, Reeves said simply. We want formalized rights to study, adapt, and implement technologies we encounter in this campaign. We're not asking for proprietary Uzari developments, only technologies already in use by your rivals. Unacceptable, Endova declared. You are mercenaries, General Reeves. Hired soldiers, not partners. Reeves' expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. Then, perhaps it's time to renegotiate our status, Duchess. Because without human forces, your reconquest stalls. The Eastern Combine has already begun adapting to our tactics. They're deploying countermeasures specifically designed against human combatants. Is that a threat, General? An observation, Duchess. One that your own intelligence reports will confirm. Reeves inclined his head slightly. We've bled for your ambition. We've died for your throne. We ask only fair compensation for continuing to do so. After the humans left, Endova called her closest advisors. They're becoming too independent, she said. Too demanding. They're also winning your war, Tazulo pointed out. The Confederacy is closer to unification than it has been in 50 cycles. At what cost? Countered an older noble, Duke Krasmak. These humans multiply among us like parasites. They absorb our technology. They establish themselves in our territory. What happens when the war ends? Do you believe they will simply return to their homeworld? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The noble Duke raises valid concerns, said Tazulo. But our options are limited. The human mercenaries are integrated into our military operations. Removing them would create a dangerous vulnerability. Then we must find a way to control them better, Endova decided. Grant their request for technology rights, but with strict oversight. Place Uzari officers in their command structure. Monitor their communications with Earth. What Endova couldn't know was that the humans were already 3 steps ahead of her. Their communications with Earth used encryption the Uzari couldn't break. Their command structure remained impenetrable to outside influence, and their technological adaptation continued at an alarming pace. By the time the Eastern Combine capitulated 13 months later, the human mercenary force numbered over 100,000. They had established permanent bases on 3 Uzari worlds. They had integrated captured technologies into their weapons, their defenses, and even their bodies. Most concerning of all, they had begun to enter Uzari politics. Commander Liss watched with growing apprehension as the scout vessel, Vanguard, maneuvered into position. On the bridge of the inevitable consequence, Admiral Vorak stood utterly still, eyes fixed on the main view screen. Vanguard reports ready for jump translation. Admiral, the communications officer announced. Proceed, Vorak ordered. The small scout ship's engines flared, and its jump drive initiated. The vessel seemed to stretch its outline, blurring, as it accelerated toward the saddle point where the Terran carrier, Phoenix, held position. For a moment, nothing happened. Then alarms blared across the bridge. Massive energy spike at the saddle point, shouted the sensor officer. Jump field destabilizing. On the screen, the space around the Vanguard rippled violently. The ship's jump field collided with the natural gravitational forces of the saddle point, creating a cascade of interference patterns. The Vanguard itself began to break apart its structure, unable to withstand the forces tearing at it. Get them out, Vorak commanded. Emergency recall. Trying, sir, the communications officer responded frantically, working her console. Jump field has collapsed. They can't. The explosion was silent in the vacuum of space, but the flash was blinding. Where the Vanguard had been a rapidly expanding sphere of energy and debris now grew. The sensors on the inevitable consequence overloaded momentarily from the intensity. The Phoenix, Vorak demanded. Where's the Terran vessel? The sensor officer shook her head in confusion. Still there, Admiral. Their position is unchanged. They appear unaffected by the detonation. Impossible, Vorak breathed. The energy release should have... Admiral, the communications officer interrupted. The Phoenix is hailing us. Vorak hesitated, then nodded. On screen. Captain Ramos appeared again, her expression grim. Admiral Vorak, we registered the destruction of your scout vessel. Do you require assistance with search and recovery? Vorak fought to control his anger. The Vanguard was attempting the same maneuver your vessel is currently executing. Why did it fail while you remain untouched? As stated previously, the Phoenix is equipped with specialized stabilization technology. Your vessel was not. Ramos's tone was even almost clinical. I deeply regret the loss of your crew members. You could have prevented this, Vorak snapped. You knew the attempt would fail. We issued clear warnings against the maneuver, Ramos replied. Those warnings were disregarded. Before Vorak could respond, a new alarm sounded. Admiral, the sensor officer called out voice, rising in panic. The energy released by the Vanguard's destruction is causing a cascade effect in the saddle point. Gravitational waves are intensifying. Vorak turned back to the view screen. The space around the saddle point was visibly distorting now, light bending in impossible patterns. Captain Ramos, he said urgently, your vessel is in immediate danger. You must jump out now. For the first time, Ramos showed a flicker of emotion. Not fear, but something like resignation. Negative, Admiral. The Phoenix cannot safely initiate a jump from within the saddle point during a gravitational disturbance. We are committed to our position. Then you've doomed yourselves, Vorak said. Perhaps, Ramos acknowledged. But our presence here may yet serve a purpose. Admiral, you must move your fleet immediately. The destabilization will continue to expand. On the sensor displays, the gravitational distortion was growing at an alarming rate, pushing outward from the saddle point in concentric waves. All vessels emergency withdrawal, Vorak ordered. Maximum safe speed. The Trescan fleet began to move, engines flaring as they attempted to put distance between themselves and the growing disturbance. But the gravitational waves were propagating faster than the ships could travel. We can't outrun it, Commander Liss said quietly. Vorak watched the approaching wavefront on the tactical display. All vessels initiate emergency jump. Random coordinates, minimum safe distance. Sir, the navigation officer protested, an uncoordinated jump could scatter the fleet across. Do it, Vorak commanded. Now. One by one, the ships of the Trescan fleet engaged their jump drives, disappearing in flashes of energy. Some made clean translations. Others, caught in the edge of the gravitational disturbance, experienced partial jump failures emerging with structural damage systems, offline crews injured or dead. On the bridge of the inevitable consequence. Vorak gave the order for his own ship to jump, just as the first gravitational wave hit. The entire vessel shuddered violently. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks. Crew members were thrown from their stations. Jump drive offline, shouted the engineering officer. Direct hit to the primary coils. Shields at maximum, Vorak ordered. Brace for impact. The second wave struck with even greater force. The ship's shields strained against forces they were never designed to withstand. Hull plates buckled. Support beams twisted. The lights failed, plunging the bridge into darkness before emergency systems activated. Commander Liss pulled herself back to her station, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead. Admiral, structural integrity failing on decks 12 through 29. Multiple hull breaches. Emergency bulkheads holding, but life support is compromised in 60% of the ship. Vorak gripped the command rail, watching as the disturbance continued to grow on the few functioning displays. At its center, where the saddle point had been a new phenomenon, was taking shape a swirling maelstrom of energy, like a miniature wormhole, tearing at the fabric of space. The Phoenix, he said suddenly. Can we get visual on the Terran vessel? The sensor officer, nursing a broken arm, managed to redirect one of the external cameras. The image was grainy, disrupted by the gravitational waves, but clear enough to see the Terran carrier still in position at the edge of the newly formed spatial anomaly. Its hull glowed with an ethereal blue light, some kind of energy field that seemed to bend the gravitational forces around the ship rather than resist them directly. How are they surviving? Liss wondered aloud. As if in answer, another transmission cut through the static of their damaged communication system. Captain Ramos appeared, her bridge dark except for emergency lighting. Behind her, Terran crew members worked with calm efficiency, despite the chaos visible on sensors. "Admiral Vorak," she said, "the saddle point has collapsed into a temporary wormhole node. The disturbance will continue to expand for approximately 18 minutes before collapsing. Any vessel within 800,000 kilometers will be destroyed when the final collapse occurs." Vorak stared at her in disbelief. "How can you know this with such precision?" "Because we've seen it before," Ramos replied simply. "This is why we warned against the maneuver. The Phoenix will attempt to stabilize the node to minimize the expansion, but you must withdraw all remaining vessels immediately." The transmission cut off abruptly as another gravitational wave hit. The inevitable consequence groaned under the strain, more systems failing across the ship. "Admiral," Liss said urgently, "we need to evacuate. The ship can't withstand much more." Vorak nodded numbly. "Order all hands to escape pods. Priority to wounded. Command staff remains until last civilian is clear." As the evacuation order went out, Vorak stared at the distant shape of the Phoenix on the view screen. The Terrans had warned them, had tried to prevent this, and now they were risking their own vessel to mitigate the disaster. Why? The answer would come later, after the wormhole collapsed in a final catastrophic energy release that vaporized anything within its immediate vicinity. After Vorak and the survivors of his command staff crowded into the last functioning escape pod, watched their flagship torn apart by forces beyond their comprehension. After a Terran rescue vessel, arriving with impossible speed, retrieved their pod from the debris field. As Vorak sat in the medical bay of the Terran ship, a human doctor treating his radiation, burns his communication implant, pinged with an incoming message. Private. Encrypted. When he accepted it, a text-only communication appeared. "We told you the rules. You tested them. There is a reason for every warning we give. Remember that." The message vanished as soon as he finished reading it, leaving no trace in the system. Vorak looked around at the efficient, advanced Terran medical bay, at the calm, human personnel, going about their duties, and understood for the first time that he had profoundly misjudged what he was dealing with. The Terrans hadn't been trying to hold back the Trescan Alliance with arbitrary rules. They had been trying to protect them from forces they already understood all too well. 4 years after hiring the first human mercenaries, Duchess Endova, now styled Empress Indula of the unified Uzari imperial domains, sat in her grand audience chamber, awaiting the arrival of the human delegation. The unification of the Confederacy had been completed 18 months earlier, but the promised withdrawal of human forces had yet to materialize. Instead, human settlements had expanded. Human-influenced technologies had proliferated. Human advisors had insinuated themselves into imperial bureaucracy at all levels. "The human general secretary will arrive momentarily, Your Imperial Majesty," announced the chamberlain, bowing deeply. Indula nodded, her elaborate headdress shifting with the movement. Around her, nobles and generals stood in rigid formation, mandibles tight with tension. None of them trusted the humans. All of them feared what was coming. The massive doors to the audience chamber swung open, and a delegation of humans entered. Unlike the mercenary leaders Indula had dealt with before, these humans wore formal attire, suits of black and gray, with subtle emblems that indicated their status in the human governmental hierarchy. At their head walked a tall, slender human with silver-white hair and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. This was General Secretary Kazimir Vasilyev, the civilian authority, who had replaced the military leadership of the mercenary forces 6 months earlier. "Empress Indula," Vasilyev said, inclining his head in the barest suggestion of a bow. "Thank you for receiving us." General Secretary Indula replied, keeping her tone measured. "I trust you bring news of the withdrawal schedule we discussed at our last meeting." Vasilyev's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Unfortunately, Your Imperial Majesty, circumstances have necessitated a revision of our previous arrangements." A ripple of tension passed through the Uzari court. Indula's primary eyes narrowed. "Explain." The human settlements on Krax and other Imperial worlds have established themselves as permanent communities, Vasilyev said. Infrastructure has been built. Lives have been established. Furthermore, the integration of human technical expertise into Imperial systems has created dependencies that would be destabilizing to sever abruptly. Those dependencies were meant to be temporary, Indula countered. Your forces were hired to unify the Confederacy, not to establish a permanent presence. And yet here we are, Vasilyev spread his hands in a gesture of pragmatism. The reality is that human interests are now inextricably tied to the future of the unified Imperial domains. Indula's mandibles clicked in irritation. What exactly are you proposing, General Secretary? Formalization of the human presence within the Imperial structure, Vasilyev replied smoothly. Legal recognition of human settlements as autonomous regions, representation in Imperial governance, and certain guarantees regarding technological development and trade. You want a seat at my table? Indula said flatly. After I've already paid you as agreed. We want recognition of what already exists in practice, Vasilyev corrected. Human influence is a fact within your empire, Your Majesty. We're simply suggesting we acknowledge that fact officially. One of Indula's generals stepped forward, his carapace rigid with anger. This is extortion. You were paid mercenaries, not conquerors. Vasilyev turned his cool gaze to the general. No one is speaking of conquest, General, merely of fair compensation for our continued contribution to Imperial stability. You've been compensated, the general snapped. With land and limited technology transfers, yes, Vasilyev acknowledged. But the true currency of civilization is not land or technology. His eyes moved back to Indula. Its power. The audience chamber fell silent. Indula felt a cold realization settling in her core. The humans had never intended to leave. From the moment they arrived, they had been establishing themselves, integrating into Imperial systems, making themselves indispensable. And if I refuse these terms, she asked finally. Vasilyev's expression remained pleasant. Then, we would be forced to reconsider our role in maintaining Imperial security. The pacification of former Confederate territories remains an ongoing process. There are still resistance movements, particularly in the eastern regions. Resistance movements your forces were hired to eliminate, Indula pointed out. Indeed, Vasilyev nodded. And we've done so with remarkable efficiency. But should our relationship with the Imperial throne become adversarial, we might find it difficult to sustain that efficiency. The threat was clear. After years of fighting alongside humans, utilizing their weapons and tactics, the Uzari military had become dependent on human support. Imperial forces alone would struggle to maintain control if the humans withdrew, or worse, if they actively supported resistance elements. You speak of partnership, Indula said, struggling to control her anger. But partners do not threaten one another, General Secretary. I speak of reality, Your Majesty, Vasilyev replied. Human settlers have established homes here. Human soldiers have died for your throne. Human engineers have built your infrastructure. We have earned a place in this empire's future. Indula's secondary eyes blinked rapidly as she calculated her options. She could order her guards to arrest the human delegation, but that would trigger immediate retaliation from human forces throughout the empire. She could agree to their demands, but that would mean sharing imperial power with these aliens who had wormed their way into her domain. Or she could buy time. Your proposal requires careful consideration, she said finally. The legal and administrative changes you suggest cannot be implemented hastily. Vasilyev inclined his head. Of course, Your Majesty. We understand the complexities involved. Perhaps a transitional council could be established, representatives from both our peoples working together to formulate a framework for ongoing cooperation. A council. A foot in the door of imperial governance. Indula saw the strategy clearly, now incremental acquisition of power system, by system, institution by institution. The humans had no need for a military coup when they could simply infiltrate and transform the Empire from within. "I will consider it," she said, signaling the end of the audience. As the human delegation withdrew, Indala remained seated, her mind racing. Around her, her court buzzed with worried conversations. She had unified the Confederacy under her rule, only to find herself facing a new threat, one she had invited in herself. "Your Imperial Majesty, Tazulo," approached his voice low. "We cannot yield to these demands. The humans already control too much. If we formally recognize their authority, we legitimize their seizure of power." "And if we refuse," Indala countered. "You've read the intelligence reports. Human weapons emplacements on cracks. Human-operated defense systems integrated into our planetary shields. The so-called Iron Rain they can deliver from orbit if provoked." Tazulo's mandibles clicked nervously. "Perhaps we could appeal to the other galactic powers. The Terran Dominion might intervene if they knew what their offshoot colony was doing." "The Terrans," Indala laughed bitterly. "They would claim no jurisdiction. These humans operate independently, remember. That was part of their appeal when we hired them." The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of them. The very autonomy that had made human mercenaries attractive now made them impossible to control through diplomatic channels. "Then we must find another way," Tazulo insisted. "Because if we yield to this initial demand, there will be others. The humans will not stop until they control the Empire in all but name." Indala rose from her throne, her 8 legs carrying her in a slow circuit of the now empty audience chamber. "Find me options, Tazulo. Political, military, economic, anything that gives us leverage against them." But even as she gave the order, Indala knew the truth. She had made a fundamental error in her calculation. She had seen humans as weapons to be wielded, not as a force with its own ambitions. She had hired mercenaries without understanding that for humans, there was no such thing as a simple transaction. Every deal was an opportunity for expansion, for advantage, for power. And now, as nobles began shifting their allegiances, as imperial institutions adapted to human influence, as the empire itself began to transform into something new and unrecognizable, Empress Indala faced the consequences of her mistake. The empire would survive, but it would not be the empire she had fought to create. It would be something else entirely, something with humanity embedded in its very foundations. Admiral Vorak looked out through the viewport of the emergency command center. Around him, the remnants of his once proud fleet drifted, in the void, shattered hulls, damaged vessels limping on auxiliary power debris fields, where ships had been torn apart completely. Of 67 warships that had assembled for the exercise, only 39 remained, and many of those were so badly damaged they might never be spaceworthy again. The collapse of the artificial wormhole node had been even more catastrophic than the Terrans had predicted. The final energy release had propagated through subspace, damaging jump drives across the fleet, and leaving them stranded far from home, depending on conventional propulsion that would take months to return them to Trescan space. "Damage assessment is complete, Admiral." Commander Liss reported entering the command center with a datapad. Her face was drawn exhausted. Like most of the surviving crew, she had worked continuously since the disaster, struggling to stabilize life support, repair critical systems, and save as many of the wounded as possible. "How bad?" Vorak asked, though he already knew the answer. "Final casualty count stands at 8,722. Liss said, her voice hollow. 4 vessels completely destroyed, 23 with major structural damage. Jump drives inoperable across the fleet." Vorak absorbed the numbers in silence. Nearly 9,000 dead. And for what? To prove that the Terrans didn't own the stars, to demonstrate that the Trescan Alliance wouldn't be bound by arbitrary rules. "The Terrans have offered additional assistance," Liss continued. "Engineering teams, medical supplies, tug vessels to help the most damaged ships return to Trescan space." "And the price?" Vorak asked bitterly. Liss hesitated. "They say there is no price, Admiral. They frame it as humanitarian aid. Vorak turned from the viewport, his yellow eyes hard. There's always a price, Commander. Always. We may not see it immediately, but it will come due eventually. A medical officer appeared at the doorway. Excuse me, Admiral. Dr. Naren requests your presence in the main medical bay. It's urgent. Vorak followed the officer through corridors that still bore the scars of the disaster-exposed conduits. Buckled floor plates, hastily sealed hull breaches. The ship's gravity fluctuated as they walked, a sign of the ongoing power distribution problems. The medical bay was overcrowded with wounded crew members, lying on every available surface. Dr. Naren, the ship's chief medical officer, looked up from a patient as Vorak entered. Her scales were dull with exhaustion, but her eyes were alert, concerned. "Admiral," she said, gesturing him closer, "we have a situation." She led him to a secluded corner of the bay, where a crew member lay unconscious on a diagnostic bed. The officer's skin had a grayish tinge, and strange patterns were visible beneath the surface, intricate networks of lines, like circuitry spreading from a central point on his chest. "This is Communications Officer Trowell," Dr. Naren explained. "He was exposed to the subspace radiation when the wormhole collapsed. At first, his symptoms were consistent with standard radiation poisoning, but then..." She gestured to the strange patterns. "This began to appear 6 hours ago. It's spreading through his system at an alarming rate." "What is it?" Vorak asked, keeping his voice low. "Unknown," Naren admitted. "Our scanners can't identify the structure. It's not organic, not mechanical in any conventional sense. It's almost as if the subspace radiation has reorganized his cellular structure according to some external pattern." "Is he the only one?" Naren shook her head. "We've identified 17 cases so far, all with direct exposure to the radiation. The patterns vary slightly from patient to patient, but the progression is consistent." Vorak stared at the unconscious officer, a cold dread settling in his gut. "Is it fatal?" "I don't know," Naren said frankly. "We've never seen anything like this. The affected systems continue to function just differently. His brain activity has actually increased, though he remains unconscious." "Quarantine them," Vorak ordered immediately. "Establish a secure ward. No one enters without full isolation protocols." "Already done," Naren assured him. "But, Admiral, our medical facilities are limited. We don't have the equipment to properly study this condition, let alone treat it." Vorak understood what she was suggesting. The Terrans. "Their medical technology is far more advanced than ours," Naren said. "If anyone can identify what's happening to these crew members, they can." Vorak's jaw clenched. The idea of asking the Terrans for help, after they had warned him explicitly against the very action that caused this disaster, was galling. But he couldn't let his pride endanger his crew further. "Make the request," he said finally. "But inform the Terrans that any examination will be conducted under Trescan supervision. Our medical personnel must be present at all times." Naren nodded. "Yes, Admiral." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. Officer Trowell has had moments of consciousness. Brief, but lucid. And he's been speaking." "What has he said?" "Coordinates mostly, star positions, jump calculations, and..." She looked troubled. "He mentioned something called the Lattice. He said it's watching us." Vorak felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's failing environmental systems. "Keep him under constant observation. Record everything he says." As he turned to leave, his communication implant pinged again. Another anonymous message. "The wormhole was not the only door that opened today. Prepare yourself." Before he could trace the source, the message vanished, just like the previous one. Vorak looked back at the unconscious officer, at the strange patterns spreading beneath his skin, and wondered what they had unleashed. The Terran medical team arrived within hours, 4 humans in specialized environmental suits, carrying equipment unlike anything in the Trescan medical arsenal. They worked with quiet efficiency, scanning the affected crew members, collecting samples, analyzing the strange patterns. Vorak observed from the edge of the quarantine zone, Commander Liss at his side. The lead Terran physician, Dr. Eleanor Chen approached them after completing her initial assessment. "Admiral Vorak," she said, her voice slightly distorted through her suit's communication system, "we've identified the condition affecting your crew. It's a form of subspace contamination we call lattice exposure." "Is it treatable?" Vorak asked directly. "Yes," Dr. Chen replied. "But it's complex. The lattice patterns are actually a form of information encoding. When the wormhole collapsed, it released not just energy, but data, specifically the underlying mathematical structures of subspace itself." Vorak exchanged a glance with Liss. "Data. You're saying my crew members have been infected with information?" "In a manner of speaking," Chen confirmed. "The subspace lattice is a multi-dimensional framework that underlies conventional spacetime. When exposed directly to organic neural systems, it can imprint itself using available biological material to create new neural pathways. Your crew members aren't sick in the conventional sense, they're being rewritten." "To what end?" Liss asked, her voice tight with concern. Dr. Chen hesitated. "That's harder to explain. The lattice isn't sentient in any way we understand, but it does contain patterns, rules, the fundamental operating principles of the universe, you might say. Your crew members are becoming conduits for those principles." "You've seen this before," Vorak said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Chen admitted. "Early in our development of jump drive technology, we had several incidents similar to this. It's why we established the safety protocols we shared with other species. It's why we warned against jumps into gravity saddle points. The implication hung in the air between them. The Terrans hadn't been restricting access to superior technology. They had been trying to prevent exactly this kind of disaster." "You said it's treatable," Vorak prompted. "We can reverse the process," Chen explained. "We've developed a procedure that can disrupt the lattice patterns without damaging the underlying neural tissue. But it needs to be done soon, before the rewriting progresses too far." "And if it progresses unchecked?" Chen's expression was solemn behind her visor. "Then your crew members will become something else entirely. Not Treskin anymore. Not anything we have a name for." Vorak made his decision quickly. "Begin treatment immediately. Whatever resources you need, they're yours." As the Terran medical team prepared for the procedure, Vorak stepped away, motioning for Liss to follow him into a private alcove. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "The Terrans weren't lying about the jump drive limitations. They weren't hoarding technology. They were protecting us from forces they already understood." Liss nodded, her expression troubled. "Which raises an uncomfortable question, Admiral. What else are they protecting us from? What other warnings have we dismissed as political posturing?" Before Vorak could respond, a commotion erupted in the quarantine zone. One of the affected crew members, a junior engineer, had suddenly awoken and was speaking rapidly, his eyes unfocused, the lattice patterns beneath his skin pulsing with an internal light. "The navigation is incomplete," the engineer was saying, his voice strangely modulated. "The beacon is active. They are coming." Dr. Chen and her team moved quickly to sedate him, but not before he locked eyes with Vorak across the medical bay and spoke one final chilling sentence. "The rules exist because they tried to break them first." As the engineer slipped back into unconsciousness, Vorak felt a profound unease settle over him. The Terrans knew more than they were sharing about the lattice, about subspace, about what lurked beyond the boundaries of conventional physics. They had established rules not to control or limit, but to protect. And in his arrogance, Vorak had broken those rules, had unleashed forces he couldn't comprehend, had exposed his crew to something ancient and alien. As he watched the Terran physicians begin their treatment, Vorak made a silent vow. If when he returned to Treskin space, he would ensure that the warnings were heeded, that the rules were followed. Not because the Terrans demanded it, but because there was a reason for those rules. A reason written in the blood and suffering of those who had tested them before. As dawn broke over the imperial capital, Empress Indula stood on the balcony of her private chambers, watching the city awaken. In the 4 months since the meeting with General Secretary Vasilyev, The situation had deteriorated rapidly. The Transitional Council had quickly evolved from an advisory body to a legitimate power center, issuing directives that carried the force of imperial decree. Human influence had spread throughout the empire. Human-backed political factions had emerged in the imperial senate. Human technologies had become essential to critical infrastructure. Human military units had positioned themselves at strategic locations throughout imperial space. And now, the final indignity, a proposed constitutional reform that would transform the unified imperial domains from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional system, with the empress as a ceremonial figurehead and real power vested in an elected assembly, an assembly where humans would hold significant influence. The protesters have gathered again, Your Majesty. Tazulo reported entering the balcony with a datapad. 50,000 at the central plaza, more arriving hourly. Indula didn't need to ask which side they supported. The humans had proven adept at mobilizing public sentiment, particularly among the formerly subjugated populations of the Southern Alliance and Eastern Combine. Promises of representation, of economic opportunity, of technological advancement, all contingent on constitutional reform. "And our loyalists?" she asked. Tazulo's mandibles clicked anxiously. "Diminishing, Your Majesty. 3 more noble houses announced their support for the reforms this morning. They claim pragmatism, but the truth is, they've been bought with promises of human technology licenses." Indula's primary eyes closed briefly in resignation. "And the military?" "Divided," Tazulo admitted. "The line units remain loyal, but specialized forces, particularly those who fought alongside human mercenaries, have expressed support for the reforms. Several garrison commanders have declared neutrality, which essentially means they won't intervene if—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. If the protesters stormed the palace, if the constitutional faction moved to seize power directly, if the empire Indula had fought to unify, slipped from her grasp entirely. "We still have options," Tazulo said, though his tone lacked conviction. "The outer colonies, loyalist military units, perhaps an alliance with the Doraxian hegemony." "No," Indula interrupted. "No more alliances with outside powers. That was my mistake from the beginning." She turned from the view of the city, fixing Tazulo with all 4 of her primary eyes. "Summon the Imperial Council, and send word to General Secretary Vasilyev. I wish to meet with him privately." The meeting took place that afternoon, in the Imperial Garden's neutral ground, away from the protests and political maneuvering that had consumed the palace. Vasilyev arrived alone as requested, though Indula had no doubt that human security forces monitored from a distance. "Your Imperial Majesty." Vasilyev greeted her with the same minimal bow he had used at their first meeting. "I'm honored by your invitation." "Walk with me," General Secretary Indula said, indicating a path that wound through exotic flowering plants from across the empire. They moved in silence for several minutes, an empress and a human diplomat alone among the gardens. Finally, Indula spoke. "You've won," she said simply. "I acknowledge it. The constitutional reforms will proceed." Vasilyev's expression revealed nothing. "This isn't about winning or losing, Your Majesty. It's about creating a stable, sustainable political framework that benefits all citizens of the Empire Uzari and human alike." "Please." Indula's secondary eyes blinked rapidly in irritation. "Spare me the political rhetoric. We both know what this is. I hired mercenaries and they decided to take my throne instead of their payment." "Not your throne," Vasilyev corrected mildly. "Just a redistribution of the power centered on it. You will remain empress. Your bloodline will continue. But the absolute authority of the imperial office will be constrained by constitutional principles." "Principles conveniently aligned with human interests," Indula noted. Vasilyev inclined his head, conceding the point. "Humans have always preferred systems with checks and balances. It's in our nature to distrust absolute power. And yet you've orchestrated a remarkably effective power grab yourselves. We prefer to think of it as guiding political evolution, Vasiliev said. Your empire was unstable, Your Majesty. The Confederacy was unified by force, but force alone cannot maintain unity indefinitely. The constitutional reforms provide a framework for sustainable integration of diverse populations. They reached a stone bench overlooking a reflecting pool. Indula settled her 8 legs carefully as she sat gesturing for Vasiliev to join her. "Tell me," she said, "was this the plan from the beginning? When General Reeves accepted that first mercenary contract, was this the endgame you envisioned?" Vasiliev considered the question. "Not in its specifics," he admitted. "But in broad strokes, yes. Humanity has always understood that military power is merely a tool for achieving political objectives. The mercenary contract was an opportunity to establish a human presence in this sector. The constitutional reforms are the logical next step in securing that presence." "And what comes after?" Indula asked. "When will you be satisfied?" "That depends largely on you, Your Majesty," Vasiliev replied. "Cooperate with the constitutional process, and you retain significant influence. Resist, and more radical elements may push for more dramatic changes." The threat was clear, delivered with the same calm politeness that characterized all of Vasiliev's interactions. Indula felt her mandibles tighten in suppressed anger. "I will cooperate," she said finally. "But I want guarantees. Explicit protections for traditional Uzari institutions, limitations on human expansion into certain sectors, and absolute assurance that imperial religious practices will remain untouched." "Those seem like reasonable requests," Vasiliev nodded. "I believe we can work them into the constitutional framework, a gesture of good faith between our peoples." Indula studied him, trying to discern any deception in his alien features. "You never needed the mercenary payment, did you? The land on cracks, the technology transfers. They were never your objective." "They were means to an end," Vasiliev acknowledged. "Footholds, points of leverage. But no General Secretary." He used his own title with a slight smile. "What humans have always valued above all else is influence. The ability to shape events, to direct the course of history." "Power," Indula said, echoing his statement from their previous meeting. "Precisely." As they continued their walk through the gardens, Indula reflected on the irony of her situation. She had sought to use humans as tools to unify the Confederacy under her rule. Instead, they had used her ambition as a tool to establish themselves as a political force within what was now her empire. The mercenaries had been paid, but not in land or technology, or even currency. They had been paid in something far more valuable: power. The power to reshape an alien civilization according to human principles. The power to embed themselves so thoroughly in imperial structures that they could never be removed. As they neared the garden exit where imperial guards waited alongside human security personnel, Vasiliev paused. "There's one more thing, Your Majesty," he said. "A matter of terminology." "Yes," Indula prompted, wary. "In the constitutional documents, we've suggested a new designation for the Empire, the Uzari Terran Cooperative Domains, a name that reflects our new partnership." Indula felt the last vestige of her imperial dignity crumble. Not content with taking her power, they would now take her empire's very identity. "You ask too much," she said coldly. Vasiliev's expression didn't change. "Consider it carefully, Your Majesty. The name change would be accompanied by significant human investment in imperial infrastructure, medical facilities, educational institutions, defensive capabilities, a gesture of our commitment to mutual prosperity. Bribes thinly disguised, and yet bribes that her people desperately needed after years of civil conflict." Indula knew she had no real choice, had not had any real choice since the day she signed that first mercenary contract. "I will consider it," she said, the same non-committal response she had given at their first meeting. But they both knew what her eventual answer would be. As Vasiliev departed with a final minimal bow, Indula remained in the garden surrounded by the beauty her ancestors had cultivated over generations. An empire built through conquest and ambition, now being transformed through more subtle means. She had hired human mercenaries to win her throne. Instead, they had changed the very meaning of what that throne represented. A lesson written in political maneuvering rather than blood, but no less painful for that. Never hire human mercenaries, she thought bitterly, unless you're prepared to surrender everything they appear to help you win. The audience in the orbital holotheater sat in rapt silence as the dual narratives reached their conclusion. The holographic projections faded, gradually returning to the simple starfield that had begun the performance. The spotlight reactivated, finding me at the center of the stage once more. And so, I said, my voice carrying in the hushed space, two beings from opposite corners of the galaxy learned the same lesson, though in dramatically different ways. I paced slowly, letting the silence emphasize my words. Duchess Endova, who became Empress Indula, discovered that when you hire humans as mercenaries, you get more than you bargained for. We don't simply fight and leave. We integrate, we analyze, we expand. The payment we truly seek isn't land or technology or currency. It's influence. The ability to reshape the world around us according to our vision. The hologram briefly showed Indula in her garden, watching as human advisors directed the reconstruction of her capital city. Admiral Vorak learned that when humans establish rules, even seemingly arbitrary ones, there is usually a reason. The warnings against certain jump drive maneuvers weren't political restrictions, but hard-earned wisdom paid for in blood and suffering by those who had tested the boundaries before. The projection shifted to show Vorak standing before the Trescan High Command passionately arguing for adherence to Terran-established safety protocols. 2 lessons. I continued, that together form a more profound truth about humanity. Whether you hire us as your mercenaries or defy our established rules of engagement, you risk unleashing forces you cannot control. I moved to the center of the stage where the spotlight narrowed to focus more intensely. In every arm's-length deal or desperate gambit involving humans, remember this: we are not merely another species with different customs or technologies. We are the product of a harsh evolution on a punishing world where adaptability and ambition were necessary for survival. We don't think like you. We don't plan like you. And we certainly don't fight like you. The holograms dissolved into darkness, leaving only my illuminated figure on the stage. There is a reason to fear what you unleash when you invite humanity into your conflicts or test the boundaries we have established. That reason isn't our technology, which many species can match or exceed. It isn't our numbers, which are modest compared to galactic standards. I lowered my voice, and the audience leaned forward to catch my final words. It's that we never ever stay within the parameters you expect. Not because we can't, because we won't. The spotlight faded, plunging the theater into momentary darkness, before the house lights gradually illuminated the space once more. The audience sat in silence for several heartbeats, then erupted into applause. Human hands clapping, vespid mandibles, clicking Melos appendages vibrating in their version of appreciation. As the applause continued, text appeared on the massive screen behind me. Tales from Outer Space is presented by T5 Productions, with special thanks to our patrons across 17 systems. Remember, these tales are based on historical events adapted for dramatic presentation. Actual outcomes of cross-species interactions may vary. I bowed deeply as the credits continued to roll, listing the production team and historical consultants who had helped bring these stories to life. The applause gradually faded as audience members began to rise, discussing the performance as they moved toward the exits. A Melos diplomat approached me as I stepped off the stage. Their translator device activated as they spoke. Most illuminating storyteller. The translator rendered their vibrations into human speech. Though I wonder, do you truly believe humanity is as dangerous as your tales suggest? I smiled, removing the stage makeup that had enhanced my features under the intense lighting. I believe, Ambassador, that understanding the true nature of any species is the first step to peaceful coexistence. Humans are adaptable, ambitious, and remarkably skilled at finding unexpected solutions to challenging problems. Some might call those traits dangerous, the Melos observed. Some might indeed, I agreed. But they can also be invaluable in the right context. The key is to ensure that when you deal with humans, you understand exactly what you're inviting into your situation. Because we never just solve the problem in front of us. You reshape the parameters. The Melos finished, a hint of wry understanding in their translated voice. Precisely. I gathered my few personal items as the theater continued to empty. Safe travels, Ambassador. And remember, there is a reason for everything humans do, even if that reason isn't immediately apparent to others. As the Melos departed, I looked around the now nearly empty theater. Tomorrow night, I would tell different tales to a different audience. Stories of human ingenuity, of cross-species cooperation, of challenges overcome through mutual understanding. But tonight's lesson was perhaps the most important. In a galaxy of diverse species and civilizations, humanity remained uniquely unpredictable. Not because we possessed superior technology, or numbers, or physical capabilities, but because we refused to accept limitations, even ones we established ourselves. There was a reason the wise treated humans with caution, and that reason was written in the transformed empires and shattered fleets of those who had failed to understand exactly what they were dealing with when they engaged with humanity. It wasn't personal. It was simply our nature. And nature, as the universe had learned repeatedly, could never truly be controlled, only respected or feared. Usually both.